Thank you for joining us for this virtual program. As some of you may know, convening practitioners in the field is one of the ways that NAA feels is the most effective way to support practitioners and advance the conservation of natural areas, those landscapes that are ecologically significant and dedicated to the protection of biodiversity. While we are hosting in-person events, we are finally, again, we are pleased to continue to offer virtual programming because we strongly believe that good science and collaboration must be available to everyone, and not just those who have the time, ability, and means to travel to in-person events. So today's program is in the spirit of this notion. Our stewardship and action field workshops, by their very nature, are intended to be small gatherings that maximize opportunities for interaction, demonstration, and the exchange of ideas and solutions. And these workshops are just one of the many ways that NAA works to get important science and information into the hands of those who work on the land and make an impact in the protection of biodiversity within these high ecological value sites. This program would not be possible or affordable for practitioners without the generous contributions of time, talent, and resources, both human and financial. I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors who have committed their time and expertise and underwriting both the in-person and virtual offering. Being able to provide both opportunities allows NAA to share this information among a much wider audience. So thank you to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Scientific and Natural Areas Program for partnering to develop and offer this program. While I'll introduce her a little later, since she will be our facilitator today, I also want to offer a special thanks to Judy Schulte. Judy is the statewide Scientific and Natural Areas Supervisor for the Minnesota DNR. And she's been instrumental for months now, over a year, helping us to pull this program together for you. This in-person and virtual workshop would not have happened without Judy's time, expertise, and energy, developing the tour and recruiting workshop presenters. So thank you, Judy. You'll be given lots of thanks today. And as this program focused on collaborative partnerships, it's important to recognize the many partners who have contributed to the great content we will share today. I'd like to offer special thanks and recognition to the Minnesota DNR Wildlife Program, the Minnesota DNR Biological Survey, the Nature Conservancy's Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota program, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for their contribution of time, talent, resources, and expertise. These are just a few of the partners who worked in tandem with one another on the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan, which we're going to focus on. I'd also like to recognize and thank the field presenters who were with us during the tour in July, many of whom are joining us again today. Just like all of you, each of these practitioners and experts are extremely busy, and we are so grateful that they have generously given of their time. They're looking forward to engaging with all of you in this virtual setting through the video presentations, exchanges of information and chat, and through dialogue during our Q&A and the concluding panel. And last but definitely not least, thank you to the USDA Forest Service and the Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management, who have underwritten this programming and who have made the opportunity to video record the in-person experience possible. And I'd like to thank Adam Ishaiak from Alantes and Riley Slivka with Agris Studios, who filmed the field presentations and then edited the videos that you'll see today. They spent 3 days with us in the field in July and were real troopers. So before we get into the details of the workshop, I'd like to share some information about the Natural Areas Association for those of you who are new to us. NAA is a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant lands and waters, all in an effort to protect biodiversity. We contend that protecting natural areas in perpetuity requires quality science to inform practices and access to reliable resources. So given this, we provide science-based content for practitioners and researchers, those seeking applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge related to the management of biodiversity and ecologically significant lands and waters. Our suite of programs, products, and services address a broad spectrum of current and emerging issues, methodologies, and best practices, all in a manner that is useful and convenient for busy practitioners and designed to achieve on-the-ground outcomes. We are here to share quality science and resources wherever you are located, wherever you are in your career, and wherever you are in your practice. You can learn more about our programming by visiting our website at naturalareas.org or by using your smartphone and this QR code that you're being presented with. So before we turn our attention to all that we will do and learn during the next 3.5 hours, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have actively conserved and protected the natural resources of the lands we will discuss today and we visited last July. For centuries, many Native people, including the Lower Sioux and Upper Sioux Indian communities, have recognized this area that you'll learn about today as their homeland. And we are privileged to share the stories of how our partners are currently stewarding these lands today. It's NAA's mission to foster a community of professionals that come together to find solutions to our shared challenges. We know there's no substitute for bringing that community together face to face, hence the Stewardship in Action Field Workshop. And we're excited when we can offer these opportunities both in person and virtually. I'd like to turn our attention to the purpose of this gathering. NAA Stewardship in Action Virtual Field Workshop, Fragmented Prairies and Grasslands, Reconnecting Habitats Through Collaborative Partnerships. And as mentioned, this gathering took place in July of 2022, where NAA and our partners with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Scientific and Natural Areas Program hosted this field workshop that shined a national spotlight on a very successful model in private-public conservation that has resulted in significant prairie protection in southwestern Minnesota. 30 natural areas practitioners from 10 different states towards 7 sites being restored and managed through collaborative partnerships under the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. And 15 presenters, all working under the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan, met with our group at each of these 7 field sites to share their experiences and expertise. The information sharing and learning that occurred during the field workshop was invaluable, as those that participated attested to. Following the workshop itself. While we toured the landscape of the Minnesota River watershed and its remnant prairies for 3 days by bus, participants got to know one another and new relationships formed. This is one of the best parts of these field workshops. That was so apparent, and one of the many fringe benefits of these in-person field experiences. Out of necessity, as mentioned, this is an in-person field workshop, and in order to give everybody that participated a really quality experience, we could only accommodate 30 practitioners. Through the wonders of technology and video, however, we're delighted to be able to share this valuable workshop to a larger audience today that includes a greater cross-section of North America. The video presentations recorded in the field highlight collaborative partnerships and explore various grassland conservation and management strategies. One of Judy's priorities from the earliest stages of planning this workshop was the desire not just to share the great work being done in Minnesota, but to hear from the participants as well. And that includes you today who are participating in this virtual workshop. We encourage you to engage with partners and presenters, as I mentioned earlier, through Q&A and chat. Now it is my pleasure to introduce not only the facilitator for the virtual field workshop, but again, someone who was instrumental in the planning and execution of both the in-person and virtual programs. Valued NAA partner, Judy Schulte. Judy Schulte is the statewide supervisor for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Scientific and Natural Areas Unit. Judy oversees a system of designated scientific and natural areas, otherwise known as SNAs. The Native Prairie Bank conservation easements, and the Natural Areas Registry lands, along with several other assistance activities for landowners and outreach to the greater public in order to ensure the conservation, research, and retention of rare species and the state's natural diversity. She's worked for SNA in different capacities for the last 12 years, but most recently transitioned from an 8-year stint as the SNA prairie biologist to the SNA unit supervisor. Congratulations, Judy. Judy grew up and returned after college at South Dakota State University in 2007 to live on her family farm just north of Morton. She's the 3rd generation, and her sons are the 4th generation to live on the family's farm. And with that, I'd like to introduce Judy.
And thank you, Lisa, for the great introduction. We were felt very privileged to be able to host this tour this past summer, and now to be able to offer it virtually. We are going to do some portions of it a little bit live here today, and then other will be video links. So we'll just work through the tour kind of virtually today. So I'm going to kick it off by introducing the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan and the partnerships that make it work. Joining me today is Steve Chaplin, the Nature Conservancy's Prairie Conservation Coordinator. Steve has been the core writer for the Prairie Plan and is a wealth of knowledge on all things prairie. So Steve, feel free to jump in at any point. Otherwise, I will kick it to you at a certain point anyway. All right. So at the time of the Public Land Survey, Minnesota had 18 million acres of prairie. This original prairie is shown here in yellow. Today, only approximately 1.4%, 250,000 acres of that native prairie remains. That's what's shown in red. In Minnesota, we are not only lucky to have some pretty significant funding opportunities like Minnesota's Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, which is also referred to as a 0.3% sales tax increase that we voted on for conservation. We also have the Environment and Natural Resource Trust Fund, which is like our lottery dollars, which is a significant funder of the Scientific and Natural Areas Program, especially in the Biological Survey. But we also have many conservation tools to help us protect and manage what is left and to rebuild what has been lost. We have fee title acquisition programs, easement programs, temporary conservation programs, cost share programs, and even tax exemption programs. Like tools in a toolbox, each tool has the right time and place for its use. Temporary conservation programs are always popular and can encourage a lot of restoration efforts to take place. However, historic ups and downs in relation to the number of habitat acres that were created or maintained have had significant impacts on animal populations. As you can see from this graph, that the bird populations tend to really fluctuate with CRP. Fee title acquisition creates a space for the public to protect and enjoy nature, but can also create tax revenue concerns, and public use at times can be damaging to the conservation values. We see here, like in northern Minnesota, especially, where some of the counties have concerns over losing tax revenue, and they create no net gain counties where they don't want to gain conservation lands because of the loss in tax revenue, even though we do pay payments in lieu of taxes. So it takes implementing all of these tools very strategically to be successful in an already significantly altered landscape. All right. So in order to do this, to strategically place those puzzle pieces, those different types of program at the right sites, at the right place, we, as practitioners across the state, conservation partners, came together at the creation of the Legacy Amendment to create the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. The first edition was completed in 2010, and it was later updated in 2018. The major goals of the plan are 1, to protect all remaining native prairie, and 2, to create and maintain functioning prairie landscapes. Partners include but are not limited to. So the original plan had 10 partners that have signed off, but we also have a lot of smaller partners. These are kind of the big core partners that signed off in the original plan. So the plan is broken down around Minnesota's native prairie hotspots, is what I call them. So they're the 28 core areas that include about 2 million, that are a total of 2 million acres, and they capture 77% of Minnesota's native prairie. So we've taken these like hotspots of native prairie and created core areas around them. And the core area goals are to include 40% grassland and 20% wetland with permanent protection of at least 50% of the land within these core areas. In order to create connectivity between these core hotspots of prairie, the plan adds in corridors and strategic habitat complexes. The corridor goals are 10% of each square mile, and the corridor should be protected grassland and wetland habitat, either on permanent or temporary basis. And the strategic habitat complexes goals is to protect 40% or to have 40% grassland and 20% wetland, and at least 50% of land be permanently protected. And these are what connects the core areas together to start creating that functional prairie landscape. The plan also includes goals for the agricultural matrix. This is all the acres outside of the cores, corridors, and strategic habitat complexes that fall within the prairie region of the state. This includes 53 major watersheds. And the ag matrix goal is 10% grassland and wetland cover within each major watershed, with at least half, approximately 5%, protected on a permanent or temporary basis. And as you can see at the development of the 2018 plan, there were only a few that were meeting that target already. We're a heavily agricultural area. The plan does not just include protection. It also includes goals around restoration, enhancement, water quality, and working lands. The restoration goals are to restore grasslands and wetlands and other habitats, including at least 295,000 acres in core areas, 82,000 acres in corridors, and strategic complexes, and then another 44,000 elsewhere, like within the ag matrix. Enhancement goals are to enhance prairies through fire, conservation grazing, haying, invasive control, wetland management on about 603,000 acres annually. There's also aquatic habitat and water quality goals. In the core areas, the goal is to identify, protect, restore, and manage the best examples of headwater streams, mid-order streams, shallow lakes. I'll let you guys read the whole list, wetlands, fens. And then in the corridors, strategic habitat complexes, and the ag matrix, the goal is to undertake local projects to create grassland and wetland complexes, increase stream buffers, expand perennial cover, and undertake more wetland restoration. Incorporating working lands conservation is also a priority of the plan. Here's a quote taken from the plan. Well-managed private working lands contribute to the viability of grassland and wetland systems, and private income generated from grasslands can be the single largest driving force for grassland conservation. So as you head west, you see a lot more of big working lands, large grazed pastures and things like that. But and in northern Minnesota, we have some of that, but really in Minnesota, a lot of that has been lost. And so in these habitat complexes, we might have the opportunity to bring some of that back. A plan is just a plan. Without execution, you basically have recycling, right? I don't know how many people have talked about putting a plan on a shelf and never looking at it again. Then what's the point of writing it? The success of the Prairie Plan is in the partnerships. There are several tiers of partnerships. Partnership between agency heads and funding councils, partnerships across agencies and nonprofits, statewide leads, and most importantly, partnerships on the ground between field staff. 10 local technical teams across, we call them LTTs, you'll hear them referenced today, across the prairie region of the state, and one state work group were created to help facilitate these partnerships. Each brings in a slightly different set of partners, and each executes the plan in a slightly different fashion. They all have their own missions, but come together for the common goal of the Prairie Plan. The plan aims to move agencies from working within their own boundaries to working across boundaries in a broader landscape context. As you can imagine, there are a lot of agencies and policy hurdles to this, but the memorandum of understanding between partnerships helps. The other thing that seems to help is writing grants together and receiving funding together through grant processes. How's this all working? The funding and protection focus increase towards prairie, and we are seeing positive results. To the point I even sometimes hear complaints from those in the forested part of the state that, well, it all goes to the prairie. And with that, I want to hand this off to Steve. Steve put together all of these statistics here for us today, and I would like Steve to maybe elaborate more on this. Anything else on the prairie plan you'd like to add, Steve, and introduce your video?
Well, thank you, Judy. You said most everything that I thought I would need to say, so that's great. So what you're looking at on your screen is the impact of the prairie plan on protecting native prairie. And each of these different bars, different color-coded bars, are different years from the start, the initiation of the prairie plan, how many acres of protected native prairie there was in the state. On the right is statewide. And the center two graphs are the ones that are in the prairie region, basically the western and southern parts of Minnesota. And then on the far left one, these two ones are basically the two left graphs are ones for the amount of native prairie that's been protected within the prairie plan features. That is to say, the core areas, the quarters, and strategic habitat complexes. I'm going to focus here on the statewide, the two right-hand graphs. So the blue is the 2011, the orange is 2016, when the first iteration of the plan was complete, and then 2021, most recently, is in the left. And you can see that we've increased by somewhat over 11,000 acres in fee title, due to the prairie plan, are largely due to the prairie plan, and in permanent easements from about 8,800 to about 1,900, another 11,000. So we've seen an increase of about 22,000 acres that have taken place in the last 10 years, due largely to the funding that is available through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment that has provided most of the funds that we've needed for doing protection as well as the enhancement and restoration work. I think we have been blessed here in Minnesota with the passage of that amendment in 2008, because it has really given us the funding that we need to be able to do most of the work. You can always use more money, but we're at the point now after 10 years is that most of the available prairie that was for sale by willing landowners, has been, protected in one way or another. And so we are now in a much longer term situation of developing relationships with landowners and their families, so that over time, when those lands become available, we will be able to act at that point. So I don't think, Judy, I have much more to say about this at this point. Let's go to the video of us talking out in the field, and we can go from there. The Minnesota Prairie Plan was actually a cooperative venture right from the very beginning. It was prompted when we passed the constitutional amendment in 2008, and all of a sudden we had the prospect of having a lot of money to spend, but not a plan or how to go about spending it. And so this was not a top-down driven thing. It was a thing where the 11 agencies that were involved in prairie conservation decided we would all get together and start thinking about how we could cooperate in spending that money. And it's on the order of $25 million a year or more that for prairie conservation. So in 2008, we started pulling that together and produced the first edition of the plan in 2010. And what it really did compared to what it was before is that it did prioritize where we should spend our money. In the prairie core areas first, and the corridors, second, and it did help direct money towards those particular places. So that was a huge benefit just right from the very beginning. And we do see results that for the money that has been spent in this first 10 years of the constitutional amendment has been directed. If you look at where the projects are, they fall pretty much within those sorts of areas. So that did drive it forward.
But the other thing it did do is that it caused us all to start talking with one another. And I think that was the big benefit of the Prairie Conservation Plan, was these local technical teams get together and talk, and then a lot of this sort of stuff we didn't envision when we wrote the plan, like the seed cooperatives and the prairie or burning sort of joint efforts. All of that stuff sort of was an offshoot of the plan that occurred. And so that we've seen a lot more of it. In some places, it works better than in other places. Actually, this is probably one of the better landscapes where things really seem to have taken off. And I think having a prairie conservation plan has not only organized all of the 11 groups that were part of it to thinking in the same way, it has also caused the state legislature, other people that have influence, politicians, the general public, to sort of start thinking about prairie. And once they start thinking about prairie, they have some place to go and refer to that can help educate them all in the same way. So I wrote most of the prairie plan, and so that I don't want to say that it's the greatest thing that's ever been, but on the other hand, from my point of view, that there has been a lot of changes from 12 years ago before we had a prairie plan.
All right. So over the next 3 hours, you will be presented from clips from a 3-day tour that took place this past summer. We presented many examples of the great partnerships and projects taking place throughout just a small portion of Minnesota's prairie region. You will hear many different stories of projects and teamwork that are taking place in this landscape. Often you'll hear OHF or legacy dollars mentioned. They are referring to our legacy amendment, that 0.3% sales tax Steve mentioned in his video. You may hear them mention ENRTF, which is the Environment Natural Resource Trust Fund, or our lottery dollars. And you will hear about a variety of programs. All of these are the tools in the toolbox of the Prairie Plan. And though it can get tough to follow at times, when you look big picture, you can see it all coming together on the landscape. We want to welcome you to our partnership and encourage you to not just listen, but to speak up, question, provide feedback, and share your own stories, and even provide critique. We may have led these tours, but every day is still a learning experience for all of us. And we want to learn from all of you. And as I always say, you'll never be judged by any question you ask, only by if you ask no questions at all. So this is the tour route of which we took for the Prairie Tour. The area in red is near Redwood Falls, which is where I'm based. And we did visit a couple of sites. We went to the Lower Sioux Historic Site, and we went to Morton Outcrops, SNA. It was really windy, and we didn't get a lot of great footage, and we don't have a lot of time to highlight those today. So we're going to kick off our tour on these northern green dots today in the virtual tour that fall within our Glacial Lakes core area. So that northern red outlined area is our Glacial Lakes core area as part of the Prairie Plan. And so we're gonna start off up there, and then as the tour goes, I'll show that we head back down to those red areas in Redwood, and then we work our way up the Minnesota River to those blue dots. And those blue dots are within the Minnesota River Prairie core areas. So I will show each stop and where we're at in this map, but I wanted to give you an overall layout of where this tour took place in Minnesota. Going to this red dot that's behind me. Oops, I got to learn to be more of a weatherman today. And this is the Nature Conservancy's Ordway Prairie Preserve. It was assembled in the 1970s from land purchases and trades financed with funds provided by Catherine Ordway, who actively supported the preservation of outstanding prairie in Minnesota and throughout the Great Plains. At this stop, Ben Carlson and Angie Miner from the Nature Conservancy discussed the management of the site and the multi-agency partnerships in this area that have resulted in great accomplishments towards connecting and protecting a fragmented prairie core landscape, productive seed harvesting coalitions, and collaborations on fire and invasive plant control. Also at this stop and later in the video, Sarah Vosick from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service talked about the Grassland Monitoring Team, which focuses on the management and monitoring of native prairie remnants. This multi-agency partnership was started back in 2007. Angie was not able to make it today, but we do have Ben, Steve, and Sarah with us. So I'm going to open it up to them right now if there's anything else they would like to mention before we play the video.
One quick thing, we're talking a lot about OHF funding and some of that state prairie recovery grant. Ordway Prairie is about 800 acres. About 280 acres was added using that OHF funding. And so that funding also goes towards the stewardship of that additions.
Corey mentioned that with climate change increasing the amount of precipitation we're getting in the spring, and with the lack of fires every year for the past 50 years, trees and brush are probably one of our biggest enemies in the prairie, because when the trees and brush grow up, it shades out the native prairie below it, and it increases the amount of places for predatory birds to roost, and so you see a lot fewer bird species nesting around the trees. So a lot of our work we do, besides restoration work, is removing trees and brush. And a lot of the activities that we're doing here at Ordway are much the same as at Lake Johanna Esker. So you can't really see it too much behind me, but a little bit over to the north of us, you can see some areas that have been mowed. And that is some of that sumac mowing that we've been doing at Lake Johanna Esker, also happening here. This was burned 3 years ago, so now that's the second year after burning that we've mowed this. We'll also be mowing some of the sumac here on these hillsides. They were mowed once last year, and they'll be mowed again this year. And then more obviously, the aspen removal. I mentioned that there's kind of 3 ways that we deal with aspen. One is begirdling, and you can see behind me there's that aspen clone that's a little bit shorter. The leaves are turning yellow, a little bit smaller. That was girdled last year, and so that's another aspen clone that is going to be succumbing to starvation here probably in the next 2 years. Closer to us, you see an aspen clone that's got some brush piles around it. This is an aspen clone that we've been cutting and treating the stumps with herbicide to try and keep the resprouts down. And there's a lot of other stuff growing up. There's cherry and honeysuckle and buckthorn that we'll have to go in and spray as well. So it's a little bit quicker way to deal with the aspens, a little bit more chemical use. We'll compare the effectiveness of each of these. And we are doing more and more growing season burns. The problem is availability of crews and resources to conduct those. So when we can't do a growing season burn, mowing is also pretty good. And the benefit of mowing is that you also don't destroy all of the native vegetation, which is certainly adapted for growing season burns, but if we're trying to do it 2 years in a row, that can be kind of hard on the native species, and you also don't have a lot of the fuel buildup that you need to conduct those growing season burns if you're doing them 3 years in a row. So the idea with the mowing is to do it 2 years in a row after burning. And if you can do it after a growing season burn, that's all the better. Now we've done some growing season burn plots out here for every year or every other year for the past 10, 15 years. And it is really striking to see the difference between the areas that we burned every other year for the past 15 years and the areas outside of that. And the areas inside there, there's hardly any sumac. And they were areas where there was lots of sumac. So growing season burning does effectively control sumac. It's just a matter of being able to get that onto the landscape.
Within the Minnesota Prairie Plan, we of course have the different prairie core areas. Where we're currently located is the Glacial Lakes Prairie Core. And this particular region that we're in, we kind of call the Ordway Glacial Lakes Prairie Core area. It's sort of the heart of the core, where we've got some of our best prairie and some of our best complexes of different properties around here. What I wanted to do was just highlight some of the work that we've been doing towards protection of the prairie around here, and some of the quite impressive achievements that we've been able to get just through acquisition and easement protections. This map depicts what we had protected prior to the OHF grants that started back in 2008. This second map depicts the darker polygons are what has been protected since that time. So since 2008, this is how much more land in these darker green polygons that we've been able to protect within this landscape. This is pretty significant. What we see here is the pink polygons are the remnant prairie that we have, and you can see what lies outside of any of these polygons. These polygons do represent either anything that's protected, so it can either be permanent easement or under agency or NGO conservation. And so yeah, with the native prairie, the remnant prairie layer on here, that's the pink. You can see just how much more we still have to go as far as protecting our prairie out here, but we've been able to come a long ways. And this was just a final map I wanted to show of this area. These different colors on here represent the different agencies that are involved. The purple is the Fish and Wildlife units. The green are the state's DNR units, the WMAs. The blue are the TNC units, and the orange are the private land permanent easements. And you can see it's quite a mosaic of different protection types out in this landscape. This is definitely a partnership landscape, and I think this really highlights the work that we all do as agencies to work with our private landowners, to work within our neighborhoods, and to work together. A lot of these complexes, you can even see it, we'll have several complexes together that are comprised of different agencies. You know, we'll have units that have TNC plus easement plus Fish and Wildlife plus DNR, all located together next to each other, and we'll work together. We'll work together for coordination of management, for coordination of burning, for grazing. That's very important in this kind of a landscape where we've got so many shared borders across the prairie. Depending on what the management is that we're trying to achieve, some of the obstacles that we might encounter are, for example, grazing or fire management. There's different levels of what we need to do for federal and state agencies. What we do with our fire program is that we hire fire crews every year with TNC, and we'll use our crews to not only do prescribed burns on our TNC properties, but also providing additional support to our Fish and Wildlife and our DNR partners. Our goal every season is that on any particular day, whenever there's a fire that a burn boss is trying to complete on the landscape, if we can provide enough people through our partnerships to provide folks to fill out the fire crews for anybody that's looking to burn in the landscape that day, that's our goal to achieve. And most of the time we're able to do that. It is quite a partnership between TNC, Fish and Wildlife, and DNR. We will assist each other on each other's burns. That does mean that we have to meet different qualifications for, you know, which agencies' requirements that they have on their burn units. And then there's other project work too for if we're doing cross grazing management that requires grazing plans. That means that our grazing plans have to meet agency standards for the different units that are being grazed. And so we have to overcome those obstacles and figure out a way to make a grazing plan that will meet the needs of both agencies. Each agency does determine its own priorities, but we do have the local technical team, which is that general oversight. We meet regularly, usually once a year, and we'll talk about different priorities within the landscape, what our resource needs are going to be, what our upcoming fire plans are going to be. We don't get into the level of deciding which units are going to be prioritized over other units. That is still done at the management office level. But we do have overall communication as far as for our seed harvesting program, for example. We want to make sure that every year we've got native prairies that we are burning that we'll be able to potentially be utilizing as seed harvesting units. We don't want to be burning all of our potential seed harvesting units in one year, and then the next year we've got nothing that we can burn that we can use as a seed harvesting unit. We
do quite a bit of seed collection in our LTT here, and the reason for that is because we have very ambitious goals for prairie restorations and reconstructions. And part of the prairie plan is increasing the footprint of prairie, not only protecting the native prairie. So in places where we acquire land with some native prairie on it, it has some old farm fields on it, we will oftentimes restore those to prairie. In other areas, we might buy a farm field next to a native prairie in order to make a buffer around the native prairie, try and increase the footprint of the native prairie on the landscape. So in order to do that at scale amongst all the agencies in this LTT, we have to create a lot of, we have to collect a lot of seed. And seed is very expensive, native prairie seed, especially when we're trying to get the high numbers of species that are really found in some of these native prairies. The prairie behind me has upwards of 200 species of native plants on it, and we try to recreate that as much as possible. And that's been something that's been increasing the last few years. So 5-10 years ago, it wouldn't have been common to find prairie restorations with less than 30 species of plants, especially the flowering plants. You might have a few warm season grasses, half a dozen or a dozen species of flowers, some of the ones that are easier to collect and easier to grow. And then over the last few years, it started to increase more to 50, 60 species of flowering plants, plus a greater assortment of grasses, more cool season grasses, to try and increase the floral diversity of the reconstructions. Now we've started doing really ultra diverse restorations with trying to get as many species as possible in there. So we're oftentimes collecting 150 to 240 different species for our restorations. And those are put into different mixes depending on the soil type. So we'll have a dry hilltop mix, we'll have a wet prairie mix, a mesic mix, dry mesic mix, and whatnot. And then some of those species are early season species that we really try and focus on getting those early species because that's often missing from restorations. So species like wood betony, prairie smoke, passflower, we collect a lot of that in the early part of the summer, and then those species we spread onto last year's restorations because the thinking is that spreading the seed soon after collecting it is better for those early season species to try and get them to germinate more effectively. Not necessarily true for every species, but that's kind of the way we've been doing it. We'll see if that works. But the whole point is that doing these ultra diverse restorations at scale requires a lot of seed. If we were to source all that seed just off of TNC preserves for our own restorations, or Fish and Wildlife was trying to get just seed from their own WPAs for their restorations, or DNR is just trying to get seed for their WMAs, it wouldn't be enough seed to go around for all the restorations we want to do. So we've created these seed harvesting collaboratives, and in this landscape we've hired interns, and I've led the interns around the landscape every summer for the last 3-4 years collecting seed. In some other LTTs they've used more contractors or more of their own equipment, whether it be WPAs or WMAs. But we've really benefited from the collaboration with DNR and Fish and Wildlife in doing those seed collection efforts, and that's allowed us to get the diversity and the abundance of seed that we need. So I've got just a few numbers to illustrate my point. We collected seed for our seed collection program from 8 different TNC preserves in this landscape, 17 Fish and Wildlife WPAs, and 12 different DNR WMAs. And so we were able to collect a lot more sites because of that collaboration. And we use both hand collection and mechanical collection methods. So hand collecting goes on all summer. We go out into a prairie and we hand pick seeds. And that's where we get the diversity numbers because we can collect all season long. We can hand pick certain species that we're going after to try and get those species in our restoration mixes. But that's still hard to get really high abundance when you're hand picking. I think the last couple years we've averaged 200 to 300 pounds of seed via hand picking. So that's where the mechanical harvesting comes into play, and we use seed strippers, which are basically big brushes to collect seed. And we've also got a combine on loan from the DNR, and we've gone around and harvested sites that have been recently burned, which produce a lot of seed. And so that's really helped us get the amount of seed up to do more restorations at scale. So some more numbers based on that. The hand collection efforts, 79% of the seed that we collected by a hand collection was on TNC properties, but 91% of the seed that we collected via mechanical means was on DNR properties. So it's kind of this inverse relationship. So because we know the TNC properties really well, we know where the plant populations are, we can go out and handpick the seeds on the TNC properties. But then DNR had a bunch of really nice mesic prairies last year that were burned, really great seed collection sites for a combine, so we were able to do a lot of combine harvesting on DNR sites. And Fish and Wildlife kind of falls in between. Some of them are really close to us. We have a lot of good hand collection sites. Some of the WPAs have really good mechanical harvest sites as well. In the past, the idea for prairie restorations was to get ultra-local ecotype seed, collect from right next to where you're restoring. And now the idea is that, with a fragmented landscape like we are in here, gene flow between species isn't necessarily facilitated as well as it could have been in the past. And so the populations of plant species aren't as well equipped to deal with stressors like climate change and habitat loss. So we're trying to artificially bring in some gene flow by collecting from, around the landscape, from as many different sites as possible for each population of plants.
Nature Conservancy, the Minnesota DNR, and the Fish and Wildlife Service help, are the three organizations that help coordinate GMT. It's an adaptive management project, an adaptive grassland management program, which I know is a term that gets kind of thrown around a lot, and people talk about it being a really great way to do things, but I've noticed, at least in a lot of audiences, when people hear adaptive management, in their heads they hear trial and error. You try something out, you see if it worked, and then if you keep doing it or you do something else. The way that we're thinking about adaptive management is a bit more formal. Well, not a bit, a lot more formal than that. So I'll just explain the way that we have this program set up. So we've got a standardized monitoring protocol that we use, which I'll describe in a minute. And we could even show people how it works if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So we've got this standardized monitoring protocol that we do, and we then also have built predictive models. They're state in transition models that are partially informed by just expert opinion, but then also because we've been doing it for 12 years now, they're also now partially informed by our actual data that we've been collecting over the history of the project. So we've got these predictive models that basically say, if your prairie is in a given state, for example, practically pristine, like this one is that we're standing on, would be one extreme. The other extreme would be it's native sod. Technically, it's still native prairie. It's never been plowed, but it's very heavily invaded by, say, smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass. That would be the other extreme of those states. And then we've got a range of conditions in between. We've got 6 states that we classify our prairies into. And it's based on the amount of native versus invasive cover out there. The project is really focused on trying to learn about smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass and how we can best manage our prairies to keep those in check or eliminate them if that's a possibility. And so the states are defined by the amount of native cover, and then some indicator species that we've identified as being good indicators of a relatively healthy prairie ecosystem in Minnesota. And then also a little bit as well on the amount of woody vegetation on the prairie. So those 3 things kind of come into play to define our states. You do the monitoring, you get an identification of what state your prairie is in. The predictive models give us, based on that state, an idea of what the best management would be to take on that site, whether it would be to burn it or to graze it, and then also how frequently to do that active management, or to rest it. That's another one of the management options. And so the model uses then your site-specific information to give you a site-specific, unit-specific management recommendation. And then the manager, over the course of the next 3 years, it's a 3-year time step for this project, over the course of the next 3 years, they implement whatever management they want to be totally frank. We hope that they'll implement the recommended management as much as possible because that will help us learn the fastest. After the end of the 3-year management cycle, then we go back out and do the post-treatment monitoring. And then that gives a sense of where that transition, how that transition happened. Okay, so we monitor, we manage, we monitor. And that second round of monitoring does 2 things for us then. One is it helps us test those state and transition models to see how accurate they are, if some of the parameters need to be tweaked at all to make them more better at predicting the outcomes that we're expecting to see. But that second round of monitoring also sets you up for the coming cycle as well. So the year 3 monitoring that you do, the second round of monitoring that you do, is both informing our models, but then also giving us now what's our current state of that prairie. And then you get a new set of management recommendations that are based both on, again, the specific state of that prairie at that point in time, which may or may not have changed, but then also based on everything that we've learned over the course of the previous 3 years, and however the model may have been updated to kind of tweak what that recommendation might be.
Judy, I'll start by just saying that Ordway Prairie, where those videos were taken, is an exceptionally rich prairie botanically. There's been over 450 species of plants recorded. So I think sometimes we underestimate how much is out there. So this is, you know, even for Minnesota is one of the richest prairies I think we know of in Minnesota.
Thanks, Steve. We had one question come in through the Q&A. And the question was, what programs are you using to incentivize easements on private lands? Are there funds in clean water land and legacy to compensate private landowners for a percentage of their easement value? And I can answer that, others can as well, but yes, we have several easement options here that we can offer. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a permanent conservation easement. We have the Native Prairie Bank conservation easement here within the SNA program. And then we have the Reinvest in Minnesota, which is a easement offered by our sister agency, the Board of Water and Soil Resources. We have the Minnesota Land Trust. So we have lots of different easement programs that are offered, and each of those does compensate the landowner in some way, shape, or form. Most are formula based, and others are like appraisal based. So there are different methods. Ours for Native Prairie Bank is like written in statute as a formula that we pay. It's a pretty high percentage of the land value. Then we also in Prairie Bank actively seek funding, and I know Fish and Wildlife Service also has funding for management of helping the landowner manage going forward. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to add anything to that on the Fish and Wildlife Service easement
and
side.
I'm not certainly not an expert on our easement program, but I can answer the basics for sure. And just like Judy was saying, we've got sort of strict language that's available to be placed in our easement documents, and the payment to the landowner depends on which land uses they have the option of retaining or haying or grazing rights on their property, and then depending on what they retain, it changes the payment for the easement a little bit. But all of our easements are perpetual, so they're attached to the title to the land. Many of our easements that we are acquiring right now are funded strictly through the OHF funds. So we're working with partners, including the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, and Pheasants Forever have been the main ones, who have applied for OHF grants and then use that money to help us in the process of acquiring easements. So I wouldn't say that there's like an extra incentive for landowners necessarily, but there is extra money available so that we're able to work with our partners to really ramp up the amount of protection that we've been doing that way.
One of the things that I think is highly unusual is that these state outdoor heritage funds, the funds that have come from the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, actually are being used to buy land that is owned by the federal government and easements that are owned by the federal government through the Fish and Wildlife Service. So, you know, I found that, you know, surprising when we first suggested that, and it was accepted. So I think the state views it. This is a great deal because here's protected land in the state that the federal government is managing. The state doesn't have to do, but that's still, I think, a fairly enlightened approach on that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. We had another question come in on the Q&A, and it is there an objective or target to remove all trees? Or are you willing to leave a % of tree cover for connectivity to tree/forest biodiversity?
I can probably answer this one. We think that in our lands that we manage, we don't really have an objective for trees to leave, simply because all the surrounding land, there's more trees than there really should be. And we know that's because we have historical aerial photos dating back to the 1930s that show a vastly fewer amount of trees on the landscape. So in the absence of fire and other disturbance regimes over the last 80 to 100 years, the tree footprint has encroached on the prairie, leading to a net loss in the prairie in that landscape. So the trees we're removing are not necessarily in areas that were historically forested. They're areas that were historic prairie. So we're trying to increase the footprint of the prairie. Now, in our particular landscape around Ordway Prairie, the landscape was a little bit more of a mosaic than most prairie areas. So there are areas that were forested back in the day before fire disappeared from the landscape. And these areas probably would have been more of an oak woodland, oak savanna with a 10 to 50% canopy cover. And so for those areas, we are trying to thin out the oak trees to a point where we get that less than half canopy cover to preserve that specific type of habitat type. But there's no real concern for connectivity between the forest remnants, just because there's so many trees in the landscape that weren't there back in the day. So we're trying to increase the footprint of the prairie and trying to restore some of those more open forested habitats. But really, as far as aspens and other brush like that goes, their footprint is vastly more than it should be. So we don't really have any maximum numbers for the ones that we can remove.
I think it's important to remember this area is part of the prairie forest border ecoregion. It's the sort of northernmost extension of the big woods, which when you think about big woods, you usually think about maple basswood forest. The maple has largely dropped out in this area. So the forests that we have here in that area are mostly oak basswood forests, and they can get pretty thick, especially on the lee side of fire breaks. There are a number of lakes, as you can see from those drone images or those drone videos that dot the landscape, and those lakes help protect certain areas where you would get the big fires coming out of the west across the prairie, and then they would get to this area of lakes, which would cause more of a mosaic effect. And so, yeah, there were, even in pre-settlement times, there were substantial amounts of maple basswood oak forest that were within just half a mile or so of Ordway Prairie.
And we should point out also that we have a preserve just a few miles from Ordway Prairie that is entirely oak basswood forest habitat, and there's not any prairie on that preserve. And it's another preserve that's several hundred acres, and it's just 5 miles away from Ordway Prairie.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question here, and keep the questions coming in the Q&A. Anything we can't cover between our tour stops, we'll cover in the panel in the end. But we got a question from David. Is the state transition model available online or elsewhere? I'm on the West Coast, but would be interested in how some of it might apply here.
Not exactly. I'm going to drop a link in the answer in the Q&A with a link to a paper that we published that explains in a little bit more detail the model that we used. But that being said, we just spent the past 3 years going through a process to revisit the model itself and redefine how it's structured. And so it's, this is the best thing that I have available to share easily right now, but and it just still does cover the bases pretty well. But I don't know, Judy or Maura, if our contact information is provided to participants. I would just encourage David to look at this, and then if you have additional questions, I'm happy to have someone reach out to me and answer them more specifically.
Yeah, and I don't know if your contact information is shared, but if you want to throw it in the chat, or if they want to reach out to Maura, she'll definitely get them. If you reach out to NAA, they'll get you in touch with us. Either way. All right. Well, I'm going to introduce the next stop, which is Lake Johanna Esker, which is located just a few miles from Ordway. So if you can see the red dot in the corner of the map, we didn't move very far, just a little bit of ways. And behind me, we were all standing on Lake Johanna Esker during the tour this summer. So Lake Johanna Esker is approximately 806 acres. This preserve is named for its esker, which is one of the few protected in Minnesota and accessible to the public. This 70-foot high serpentine ridge of sand and gravel was deposited by a stream that flowed below the ice of the retreating glacier and leaves us today with a commanding view of the surrounding Ordway Glacial Lakes landscape. This landscape includes dry sand gravel prairie, marsh, and basswood bur oak forests, as we've kind of touched on in our earlier conversations. At this stop, Angie, Ben, and Steve talked about this unique site, the Nature Conservancy's Prairie Recovery Program utilized for its protection, and the management currently taking place. The video clip we're going to share today is of Angie highlighting the management activities taking place. Ben and Steve, did you want to add anything before we kick it off to the video?
No,
Nope, not here.
All right, we'll play the video.
We are in what we call the Prairie Forest Border Ecoregion. So we are in a zone where the prairie is starting to come together with the forested region. We do have more oak communities out here. Some are going to be more open, like this, oak savanna that we would have out here, and then we also have areas that are more of an oak woodland type habitat. As Scott was mentioning at the last site too, pretty much all of these other trees out here that aren't oak were not here 100 years ago. When we first acquired this piece, it was very overgrown with trees, and it had a big cedar tree encroachment out here. You could almost, in a sense, miss the fact that we had this beautiful esker just from the scattering of cedar trees, and it was very overgrazed as well. They had grazed it season long, year after year, and it really suppressed a lot of the vegetation out here. I do have a before photo. I'll kind of show it here and then I'll pass it around as well. But this gives a little bit of an idea of what this unit used to look like. It was in the foreground, you can kind of see that it's just very suppressed, overgrazed grass. And in the background, back here, this is the esker that we're looking at now. That is completely covered in cedar trees. All of this that we're standing on out here too had a severe cedar tree encroachment. We also had other trees that were encroaching along the woodlands as well, things like aspen and box elder and ash trees. So what we did after we acquired this unit back in 2015, we did a big tree removal project. We cut off all the cedar trees out here. Anything else that was not an oak tree, we left all the oak trees, and you can really see there's a lot of big open grown oak trees out here. This is an area where we've got some nice savanna type habitat was starting to get encroached in. So we were able to open up all of that, and we rested the unit, kept the cattle off the unit for several years, and we reintroduced fire back into the landscape. And when we did that, it was impressive how that prairie came back, even after that suppression with the grazing and with the lack of fire and with the cedar encroachment. It just popped right back up. We had a lot of areas that had some really good prairie plants. Prairie smoke, we've got a field right over by the entrance of where we came in, just off to the east. We've got some very large patches of prairie smoke, which is in early season 4. And then up on the hilltop too, with this esker, when we took out the trees and we burned it, we had a pretty good infestation of sweet clover as well. We spent a lot of time with our crews going up and down those hills and cutting back that sweet clover. It wasn't fun. It's very steep, and you guys will kind of get a sense for that too. We're going to try for a hike up this prairie. But after we set back that sweet clover, we reintroduced fire, we got rid of those cedar trees, that prairie came back. We've got some really nice prairie up on that hilltop. Another thing that we're doing out here too is we have reintroduced cattle onto this unit, so we are doing patch burn grazing. This is where we are, we've divided this, the whole Lake Johanna Preserve that we have into different parcels, and we'll burn a separate unit every year, and we'll allow cattle into the unit, and they've got access to the entire unit, but they will tend to focus in on that recent burn patch as well as the patch that was burned and grazed the previous year. And so far, this is the third year that we've implemented the patch burn grazing on this unit. We're still a little bit in a stage of, last year we had a pretty severe drought out here, so it kind of set back some of the comeback that we would see. But we're really excited to kind of see some of that impact, I think, this year with a little bit of a wetter season that we're having. As you can see out here, we do have some interesting stuff going on beneath our feet. We've got an area that we've done a lot of chemical treatment on. This is an area where we had it used to be farmed, and we basically are doing an interseeding out here. So we use Roundup treatments in order to kill the existing vegetation, and then we're going to come back through and interseed it with our local native seeds that we've been harvesting. The native seed that we use is a part of our seed collaborative where it's all locally harvested. Otherwise, we have additional prairie construction units that we've been doing on this preserve over on the far north side. We won't see it today. We have a track up there that used to be old CRP as well as old farm field, and we've reconverted that back into native species. We're using that we've seeded that with species that were all locally harvested either through our mechanical or our hand harvesting program. And those are sites that we're hoping to be able to develop to be future seed harvesting sites for themselves. We do differentiate when we're harvesting seed from units that were seeded with vendor seed that might be coming from a little bit further away and from other ecotype sources, and our really local seed.
All right, I will open it up to Steve or Ben if you guys want to add anything additional or any questions coming in. All right, we do have one question that came through the chat. Are there any private partners you're working with, such as land trusts? Do they have resources like RX burn teams available to them to support this work as well?
Yeah, I guess we do partner with land trusts from a protection standpoint for easements and whatnot, but from a stewardship perspective, we do work with contractors quite a bit, private contractors, and mostly for brush control and herbicide treatments and seeding restoration areas. Most of the prescribed fire activity on the landscape is conducted either by TNC, Fish and Wildlife, or DNR.
Yeah, I think that's mostly because those are the three entities that have staff on the ground in the area. And so the other entities that, the land trusts, Minnesota Land Trust and others, do come in and do projects and will, work in the area, but they don't have staff in the immediate area.
Yeah, I would add too, like as it changes as you move around the state, what other partners there are. And as you head towards the Metro Twin Cities area, there's, other nonprofits like Great River Greening and Friends of the Mississippi River and things like that. So it really kind of varies. Pheasants Forever is a pretty good partner, especially on the protection side. But they also apply for grants for management work too. And so I guess mostly nonprofits is what we see partner a lot. But again, like others mentioned, we have some really phenomenal contractors that we do work with.
And we do work frequently with private grazers that graze the property out there. And so we've had a couple of instances out there where several agencies will go together and hire the same contractor and manage their joint properties, with the same individual or same entity. So there are some private enterprises that get involved with this sort of, but it's primarily the three, the Nature Conservancy, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the DNR.
Yeah,
Some contractors do prescribe burning on private lands, and that is a good resource for private landowners wishing to burn their prairie, which isn't too common unless they have CRP contracts. But on TNC and other agency lands, the aforementioned partners are the main actors in the prescribed Parle world.
Yeah, and I would note, like on our private easements, we have landowners that are actively working and partnering with us to do management on the easements too. So I mean, that's a pretty key private partner for us.
And adjacent to this Lake Johanna Esker, not very far away, there's a group of about 3 or 4 landowners that have sort of formed their own, I wouldn't say burning cooperative, but at least they get together to do joint burns and move it around their properties where there's no state or federal government involvement at all.
And sometimes
go ahead.
prairie bank easements will be burned by private contractors as well.
Yep. Or by us as DNR employees too.
Right.
Yep. And sometimes the landowner does their own burn. So it can be any of those really. All right, I'm going to move us to the next question. What was the source of cedar tree encroachment? Where were they cut and chemically treated? Are they native in that landscape? They're from Ontario, Southwest Ontario.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Cedar encroachment is something that's been spreading from the south. It started in Oklahoma and Kansas, and now it's creeping into South Dakota on a very large scale. But in Minnesota, we've always had cedar trees, and the eastern red cedar is native to much of the Great Plains. However, it's what I would consider an aggressive native. So historically, prescribed fires would have kept the cedars in check, just like most of the other woody species on the prairie forest border. So you would have seen the red cedars growing on protected north hillsides, on the north sides of lakes, all the other places where trees would have been protected from fire historically. So then the absence of fire, cedar trees have berries that birds love to eat, so it doesn't take much for them to expand out from where they're growing. And in a matter of 10 or 20 years, you can have a prairie go from mostly grass with just tiny little cedar trees to being a cedar forest. So it doesn't take long for the cedars to encroach. And then coupled with that is a lot of people, private landowners who use their lands for hunting, will plant cedar trees in their prairies as a type of wildlife habitat. It's a little bit misguided because the prairies are probably a better habitat than the cedar trees, but there's that abiding interest in providing tree cover for wildlife that seems to persist. So removing the cedar trees is really rather simple. You just have to cut it. Chemical treatment is not necessary because they're gymnosperms. They do not have meristems that will produce shoots from a stump. So all you have to do is cut it off flush with the ground, and you don't need to do any chemical treatment. So a lot of our cedar control is done with carbide cutters and other large mowers that we can come in and cut trees up to 4 inches in diameter with machinery. Anything above that, we'll have to use chainsaws usually.
And and once you get them cut down, if you have a regular fire, fire will take out cedar trees. Anything that's less than 5 or 6 feet tall, are pretty susceptible to fires. And so, they're in that landscape, they are ubiquitous. I don't think there's hardly any place in that landscape that you're not within, a couple hundred yards of a cedar tree. So, we're never going to get rid of all of them, nor do we want to get rid of all of them, but they weren't out in the prairie areas proper, pre-settlement because of the frequent fires. And, and that's the way we like it.
Yeah, and, there's 2 aspects of this that are impacted by grazing as well. A lot of pastures that have cedar trees encroaching on them are ones that were really grazed heavily because cattle don't eat the cedar trees. And then if you try and burn a pasture that has been grazed heavily, you don't have the fuel loading there that is needed to really get the intensity up to kill the cedars as well. So oftentimes you have to rest a pasture for a couple of years in order to get enough fuel to burn the cedars. And that's a little bit harder to convince landowners to do.
Sounds great. Well, if there aren't any more questions right now, we can head into our break. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So I'd say we'll go back to the tour at 1:35. It's 12:35 here in Minnesota. So if you see me hesitating on time, and Maura has a great slideshow of photos to share during the break time. So take a stretch, run to the bathroom, get a drink, whatever you want to do. But Maura also has a great photo slideshow to share. So we'll be back to the tour at 12:35 Minnesota time, Central Time, 1:35 Eastern. All right, welcome back. Hopefully most of you got a little break before we kick off to our next tour stop here. Just gotta maybe get a little organized here. All right. So after we left Lake Johanna Esker, we're actually doing this tour backwards virtually for those of you who were actually on the tour. We're gonna head south today to Randall Waterfowl Production Area, which is one of the first tracts the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service purchased using the Legacy Amendment through their partnership with Pheasants Forever. At one time, most of the tract had been farmed and drained, but later the wetlands were restored and protected with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wetland easement, leading the way to its later protection through fee acquisition. Scott Gloop with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service went into depth on the numerous protection, restoration, and management projects that have taken place on site over the last decade. Scott, do you want to add anything before we jump to the video?
I don't have anything to add. Just welcome to everyone.
We first purchased this tract, it looked real similar to all that prairie there. See all the cedars and aspen and massive stands of sumac. That's what a lot of this unit looked like. So we came in right away, and actually DNR worked with the landowner previous to that to do a bunch of the cedar work. And we came in right away and did a whole bunch of additional tree work to take out a lot of the deciduous trees. There was Siberian elm all over it and cottonwoods all around the gravel pit. But it had dense stands of sumac over your head, this big around. You'd swear there was nothing underneath it. It was beautiful in the fall when it turned red and orange, but it was terrible. And so we really struggled. What are we going to do with that sumac? Because sure, we could go in with Garlon and spray it all, and then whatever might be alive underneath is dead. So I asked my biologist to do some research, and he came back to me after a while and he says, from what I'm reading, you can get rid of a lot of woody vegetation if you mow it twice a year for 3 years in a row. And you want to time it so it's just reaching its terminal bud, which around here is late June, July on sumac. And then you want to come back and hit that regrowth in around late September. Well, you can see what the topography is here. So we got our skid loader and carbide cutter out, and we needed a carbide cutter the first time because the sumac's, some of it's this big around and over your head. Mowed it all down, and we had to go straight up and down the hills. You didn't dare turn sideways on these hills. Even with the tracked skid loader, it was, the guy that did it told me, he needed to go home at night and relax because he had the pucker factor on all day long. Okay, so we did that. And then after the first mowing, we were able to come in with much lighter mowing equipment, just a deck mower, because, the sumac is quite tender, the regrowth. And 3 years in a row, mowing it twice a year, pretty much knocked it completely out. And I don't know if we want to walk over there. This hill wasn't bad, but over there, that whole hill was solid sumac. And it has come back beautiful with natives. It's really, really nice stuff. This site is a brand new site. This thing was covered with spotted knapweed. before we purchased it. I assume that he fed his cattle in the winter out there, and I would imagine it came in with hay, you know, because we don't have a whole lot of it in this area yet. So if you look at the grassy areas, you see that kind of silvery grayish hue. That's all spotted knapweed. It's bad. But so 2 years ago, we've released several species of weevil that we're finding are working quite well on spotted knapweed. So we've just got some new release sites over there on that. And then the low areas, that's all plumeless thistle, bull thistle. That's all the areas that we disturbed. The building site, we came in with dozers and excavators and literally dug everything out, the root balls of the big trees and everything. So it was black ground when we were done, and it was seeded last spring. Well, last summer we had a terrible drought here, so the seeding is it needs a lot of help. It'll come. Every seeding will come. I've been doing it for a lot of years, and I've learned just to be patient, but sometimes you need to do a lot more management on it if you don't get a good catch. So we'll probably be mowing all that early next week and just knocking it down. Up here on our prairies, our invasive species are, you know, woody vegetation and then some of the others I mentioned, and we try our best to implement management practices that don't include a herbicide. Other than cut stump treatments, you know, when we come in to initially cut the deciduous trees, you got to treat them with herbicide because it just makes them mad and they come back worse. When I was out in the Dakotas where it was drier, I don't know the difference. We could cut a tree, deciduous tree, and it died. Over here, almost nothing you cut dies, unless it's a cedar or a pine. But let me tell you, native prairie is priceless. Public lands are priceless. Regal fritillaries are priceless. On the money side of it, our budgets with the Fish and Wildlife Service are bad right now. Our staffing's low. If it was not for the Outdoor Heritage Fund and all the wonderful partners, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Lands, we would not be able to have done what we've done.
Scott, do you have anything you want to add about the video before we jump into some questions?
I do not.
All right. Well, we've got one question here. What would you recommend for knapweed management if you may not have the weevil species? What was your process for introducing the weevil? And is there any concern for it affecting non-target species?
Knapweed is a relatively new invasive in this area, so we don't have a whole lot of experience with it. A lot of our lands, of course, are not native prairie, so you know, if we want to, we can go back in and break everything up and start all over if we'd like. In most of this area are heavy soils. It just cannot compete with good native seeding. It just isn't a problem. It's a problem in the light soils, the drier sites. And as I said, in that site, since much of it was prairie, you know, we didn't want to use any herbicide. And we have started releasing weevils probably 7 or 8 years ago, and we're happy with it. It's a slow process. It's not going to take it completely out, but it knocks it down to a level where it's really not a problem in my view. As far as am I concerned? I'm always concerned with everything that we do out there. There's negative side effects on everything, but I think USDA and those people that study these things, these bioagents, do a much better job than they used to, and I have to trust them. And based on what we know, there aren't any other, you know, plant species in the area that they're going to impact. Do I know that? No, but I just have to trust. So I hope that answers the question. I again, you'd have to get online if you wanted to learn a lot more about how to control that.
Scott, I kind of had a few comments on knapweed as well. It is a biennial species. We find that it shows up mostly after new gravel has been spread along roadsides. For some reason, a lot of the gravel pits in the area around us have knapweed infestations. So typically early response, rapid detection, or early detection, rapid response of knapweed along freshly graveled roads and old gravel pits seems to be a pretty good strategy. It's not too hard to pull it, but it does produce a lot of seeds. So if you have a lot of it growing, sometimes we'll have to spray the basal rosettes with milestone and then come back and pull whatever bolts. Doing that a couple years in a row hopefully will work, but there's some areas where it's dense enough that the weevils are really the only practical solution.
Yeah, I would add, I guess I didn't think about that. A lot of our infestations around here from herbaceous invasives come in our parking lots. Our lands are open to the public. They get used heavily by hunters. And so we have parking lots on them. So we have a program where we go and monitor each of our parking lots every year. And we're talking several hundred just for my wetland management district. And we really target what we're seeing in that parking lot and try to hit it before it has a chance to establish. And you're exactly right. A lot of the invasives in our area get spread by roads. They get established on the edge of roads. The road authorities mow their roads. When they mow, they're spreading the seed right down the line, and that's a lot of our problem.
Sounds good. So we're gonna go into our next tour stop since we didn't have any other questions come through the chat. Remember, you can always ask questions about past tour stops or past presentations throughout this process, and we always will have time at the end for more questions. So please keep sending them our way. All right.
So everybody, welcome to what we call our Lac Parle 36 Native Prairie Bank. We name our prairie banks based on the township and the section that they're in. Just makes it easier to keep track of them. And this is private land owned by Wayne Erickson, who's this gentleman over here in the baseball cap. We enrolled this in 2017, I think it was. Yeah. Yep. And we burned it. I want to say 2018. This whole section was burned. And now we're doing a project on the north end looking at different brome control methods. And Wayne's helping us out. He's been graciously helping us with the haying part of that. So this native prairie bank protects about 280 acres, I think right around there, that's enrolled of native prairie. Somebody asked kind of, what are your criteria for looking at the whether it should be enrolled or not? Well, this is a really nice big property of contiguous prairie. It's got good diversity. When I first came out to meet with Wayne, he had like a notebook of all kinds of photos of plants and stuff, and so just showed all the diversity on the site. So that's a lot of what goes into it. So this is a nice large block of native prairie.
This is a really diverse prairie, but it does have a lot of our smooth brome in it, which has been kind of a problem management-wise for us up here in Minnesota. We've been having some cooler, wetter springs. We get a lot of nitrogen deposition, which has really helped smooth brome invade even our really diverse prairies. It can get pretty problematic to the point where it's starting to exclude a lot of the other plant biodiversity. We're looking at trying to control smooth brome with a number of treatments. So on this study we have, we're trying to look at how spring fire, biannual spring fire, annual spring haying, annual fall haying, how effective those are at reducing brome in our diverse prairies. So we have one setup here. There's 3 other sites with a similar setup where we have about 3 to 8 acre plots that are getting those treatments.
Dates that we're doing the treatments are aimed to hit brome at its most sensitive time. So when it's done the most drawing of reserves from the roots and rhizomes before it starts putting energy back down into the rhizome. So the idea is hit it when it's at its most vulnerable. And so we've been looking at kind of, was it May 15th to June 15th for our treatments to try to hit that most critical time to really, hit the brome harder than anything else. So, and we don't expect that we're going to get rid of brome, but we want to look at how we can really just keep it from expanding and taking over. So keeping it kind of in check.
So for each of the 4 treatments on each site, we have 20 points that were selected with grits within the plot. And there's about a 10-meter boundary around the edges that we didn't put sampling points in. 10 of those sampling points in each plot, we just count brome stems. So we will navigate to a sort of semi-permanent point with a sub-meter GPS and point the quadrat to the west and drop it. Count all of the brome stems within a 0.1 meter quadrat after fluffing the vegetation. And that's our brome counts for the plot. Our stems, yeah, sorry, tillers, yeah, yep. Yeah, who knows what's a brome plant? It's a good question. So count the number of stems, and then for the other 10, we'll do the brome counts and full vegetation of the plot. So we'll record all of the species that occur in the 0.1 meter quadrat and then also in the 1 meter quadrat. The only thing we're doing covers on right now is just brome. This is the 3rd year of treatments. We just sampled, and there's a lot of different responses that the brome is having. Right now, it seems just from what we're kind of seeing that the spring haying really is fairly effective. The first couple of years, we actually had increases in the number of brome stems due to the haying, and I think there's some sort of response that it has we can cut off where it shoots out multiple tillers that year, and I think we're finally getting to the point after this 3rd year where it's starting to run out of carbohydrates and stuff to keep doing that. The spring hay stuff this year had historically had something about 25 to about 50 brome stems per 0.1 meter quadrat. We're down sub 10 in a lot of them, maybe 15 on the high end this year. So really excited to work that data up. And I'm excited for you guys to see it. It looks like the natives are being a lot more competitive. The brome actually in these spring plots gets to be pretty funky looking. So these chonky kind of long leaf things, this is brome, it's just being weird. They can also be fuzzy. So right now we're probably in one of the more dense patches of brome here. Just so you're able to see kind of, it gets to look a lot like andropogon when it's cut off like this, but it's all brome. It's talking about kind of like that stress response sort of thing. And this is what, like the first couple years of haying, we were seeing a lot of this going on where there's, maybe it was three tillers in the pre-treatment year, and now it's just this clump of tillers. So we ended up having like more brome stem counts those first couple of years, but at this point I think we're starting to get some brome mortality in here.
So I skipped or missed introducing this site before we went to the video. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of location information. So that native prairie bank that we just watched the video on is actually, if you see that purple dot on the map behind me, that's Redwood Falls, where our core of our tour was. And then we headed up the Minnesota River to the red dot, which is the Lac of Parle native prairie bank. So I just wanted to clarify that we had moved kind of locations within the prairie region of the state. And the Lac of Parle native prairie bank that we visited, as Rhett mentioned, is privately owned. And it's within our Prairie Bank Conservation Easement Program, which was established in 1987 and it's a perpetual conservation easement administered by the Minnesota DNR Scientific and Natural Areas Unit. And it aims to work with landowners to enhance and protect high quality native prairie while leaving land in private ownership. And in partnership with landowners, Native Prairie Bank currently protects and manages about 15,000 acres of native prairie and associated habitats across the prairie region of Minnesota. Native Prairie Bank is unique in the fact that not many, if any, state governments offer easement programs associated to the natural areas programs. I could be wrong, but if there are, I haven't heard of them. And this is a very important tool in our conservation toolbox here in Minnesota. The SNA unit actively seeks funding and works to manage these easements like we would our fee-owned lands to protect the rare resources they house. So as you see here, we're doing the adaptive management on site to try to get brome control into place. So I want to go back to Dustin, who talked about the brome study, and I want to give him a chance to talk about the results of that brome study.
Yeah, so we got a chance to work up the data slightly, kind of an interim result here. And kind of over the course of the first number of years, so first couple of years, we weren't really seeing much change in brome stems. And after this year of data, it does appear at least the spring hay plots had some amount of decline in the brome tillers per 0.1 meter square. Whereas the other two treatments, the fall hay and spring burn, we're seeing less of an increase in brome tillers than the control plots that didn't have any sort of management. So maybe some good news then the spring hay plots are at least showing some sort of decrease in brome abundance. Looking at native richness, I actually saw an increase in the spring burn plots, whereas there's kind of a small decrease in native diversity in the control plots and almost no change in the other managements. So some interesting results for us to think over with some of our managers.
Thanks, Dustin. Brad or Rhett, do you guys have anything you want to add before we open it up for questions?
I don't have anything, Judy. I guess I would say that we have currently 169 Native Prairie Bank easements in the state, possibly 2 more that are really close to closing. So
yeah, and I would also add the landowner for this site was out there the day of the virtual tour. And it was great to have him there. And he talked about his experience with the program, which we tried not to intimidate him. It all seemed positive. Hopefully he wasn't scared that it was all practitioners and him, but.
Yeah, I guess maybe, Judy, the only comment I'd like to make would be that, obviously haying isn't something we can do everywhere. We were, I think all of us were a little surprised how hard it was for us to find suitable sites for this trial. Or people willing to hay on the schedule we set, and or just people who were willing but maybe didn't carry their end. So it's a trial. It's a tool we can use, but like some others have said, it's we need a lot of different tools available to try.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the native prairie that we do have left here in Minnesota is here sort of for a reason, right? It wasn't easy to farm. It wasn't easy to develop. And so I always joke around that we manage what nobody else wanted to. And it does. It leads to some complicated, as Scott talked about in his video, the steep hillsides and the rocky terrain. And so, that's always a big factor in any of our prairie management. All right, I'm gonna see if any other questions have come in. All right, we've got a question here. Do you have a photo of the brome haying method and how well the brome grass burn?
So we do have some photos of after some of the haying occurred. We generally had them hay pretty low to try to get as much of those kind of stem carbohydrates that the brome is storing as the hairs could. Rhett or Brad, do you have comments about the fire? I just saw photos of it, but it looked like the burn was really worked pretty well.
Yeah, when we burned this site, we had a pretty good burn. It was well within our prescription, but it was fairly dry, which helps to get the green brome to burn. And we had plenty of litter to carry the fire and kind of scorch the brome. Burning that late with brome is pretty smoky, and so we have to consider that both for impacts outside the the burn unit, like neighboring impacts, and also for firefighter safety. But it burns pretty well. It might be tough to get it to burn a second spring as well, but yeah, we had no problem getting it to burn.
Yeah, I just showed a picture. This is actually at a different site that's in the same study, but of the burn when we were doing it. And Brad, I think this is Rock Ridge, and we were burning it like June 1st or 2nd. Does that sound right?
I can tell you in a minute. One thing I was going to say though is I don't remember if the presentation covered kind of that we've got multiple sites, or maybe I've just heard it so many times, but was that covered in the original video or presentation?
I think I just mentioned that we had it replicated on 3 other sites in addition to the one we did the field day on. So my notes on the fire are that it did seem to really do well at least top killing all the brome, and seemed to have a lot of Kentucky bluegrass mortality on a number of the sites. So I was really happy with the burns that were done.
And Judy, that photo you're showing from Rock Ridge would have been June 2nd.
Yeah, and I mean, the burn carried really well. And, like Brett mentioned, it was a smoky burn, but I thought it worked really well that day.
And we've got a question in here from Stephen asking about soil samples. Dustin, do you want to cover what's been done for soil chemistry?
Yeah, so we partnered with a professor from Carleton College, and we took soil samples, so soil probe samples, to try to get at nitrogen and also microbial activity measurements at the beginning of the study, so before we had started any treatments. And then those will be repeated within the next year or two to get at the change over time in those. In addition to that, at the beginning of the experiment, we used soil tags. So they stay out during the growing season and kind of measure the plant or root available nutrients. So we have measurements from those from the kind of pre-study year, and then we will take another measurement hopefully this last year. Yeah, we didn't have a chance to. I would love to get estimates of how much nitrogen we're taking off of the sites, but it was kind of too much for what we're up to right now.
As an afterthought, we probably should ask the partners to keep track of how many bales they took off. That could be just kind of an estimate. They did say that, Wayne said that as far as haying at that time of year, he was getting good hay for his purposes. So it was, it was probably feeding cows right now. And he said he was pretty satisfied with the quality of hay that he was getting. So.
Yeah, and I think for that last question there about, a prairie cooperative and management tools, I think we're just starting to really explore this a lot more. And I think those questions about, well, how do we, build contractors or landowners that are willing to hay for us and build those relationships or some sort of cooperative, it's in the future still. We're lucky because there are still, in a lot of these core areas and landscapes with a lot of prairie left, there are still, you know, folks that will hay and hay with small equipment, just because that landscape kind of lends itself to that. And so we've gotten really lucky there. Whether you know, that continues to get passed on or not to those farmers or producers' children is a big question.
Another thing with the haying is we were fortunate that we had landowners that were either landowners or others that were close by who were willing to do this stuff. So we didn't have to try to hire somebody to do it. There's a lot of ditch haying that gets done in Minnesota. And as Scott brought up, road ditches are a great corridor for invasive species. So haying equipment is also pretty difficult to get real clean. So that's been a real big concern for us, trying to, you know, look at implementing haying for management at scale is you know, the possibility of introducing additional invasive species.
Yeah, I don't know if Rhett or Brad, you guys have done a lot of just surveillance out there associated with that haying. At least in the data, I haven't been seeing a lot of stuff come in, but we're pretty explicit about cleaning equipment with the folks that were haying for us as well. So
yeah, there seems to be, I think, a statewide issue of finding people that are willing to hay, because the problem with most prairie areas is that it's really hard on the equipment when you try to hay in those areas, because, you know, they're uneven, there's gopher mounds, there's all sorts of stuff out there. And unless you're willing to, you know, have a contract with somebody that to hay the same area, you know, over a number of years, people aren't often very interested in haying those areas, because, you know, the first year is usually the one where all the equipment breaks.
And people are moving more towards hay binds and moving pretty fast when they're haying. I've talked to a farmer that was renting from a prairie bank landowner and asked him, you know, if they'd be interested in haying some of the prairie ground, and he said no, because they basically, for him to make money, he had to move too fast doing it to avoid destroying his equipment. So for him, it was a dollars per hour kind of calculation in his head that with the rocks and such, you know, he couldn't make it pay if he's cutting with an old sickle bar mower. He needed to use a hay bind, and he had to move fast. So there, you know, methods have changed. I know Wayne, who owns the Parle 36 Prairie Bank and was doing the haying there, he cuts with an old style sickle bar mower, and they're a little more forgiving with rocks. I mean, a little more forgiving, I wouldn't say totally, but those are, you know, they'll kind of bounce over rocks, you know, hit them too hard and stuff. And plus, he really knows his property. He knows where those rocks are. So, you know, it's difficulties in kind of trying to take it to scale, but you know, there are other advantages to haying that, you know, as far as leaving, you know, if we can leave stubble behind, that's good for some insects, and so, you know, gives us some other options. But
so we got another question through the chat, and we've got other coming in through the Q&A, and I am going to save some of these Q&A ones for at the end during the panel. But we'll try to, let's take a look at the one of the chat from Michelle. I heard you say that Kentucky bluegrass declined after the spring burn, but did the brome decrease as well? Is there just the 1-year data post burn? Just wondering if the decline persisted, and did you say it was a late spring burn?
So the burn timing was late. I don't know what the range. It was the last couple days of May into the first week of June for all the sites. Something of that nature. We kind of set our window the same as that timing for the spring hang. So May 15th to June 15th is when we wanted the burn to happen. To hit that kind of like ideal phenology for impacting brome in the spring.
And the timing kind of came from some research and looking at growing degree days and growth patterns. And there was some discussion of that. One of the problems is trying to base management and such on growing degree days is kind of difficult, to say, okay, we got to get out there when there's 163 growing degree days for brome. So we just kind of looked at the weather data and figured out kind of what would be the good timing there.
Yeah, the burn window that year was May 27th and June 2nd, were when the 3 sites that got burned when that work got done.
And as you can see, Brad uses the paper on his desk to start the burns.
Oh, you can see stuff.
Just had to give you a hard time.
You can only see one direction.
All right. One last question. Keep the questions coming. We'll tackle them in the panel at the end, but we're gonna do one last question here before we move on to introduce the next site. So, the question is, have you seen grassland birds using the brome habitat for breeding?
So I actually was thinking about this the other day because we're kind of out there during breeding season, and even so when we first did the study, I really didn't notice a whole lot. I mean, usually a lot of places I'll be kicking birds up and stuff as I'm going through them. And I'm not sure if a lot of these places were really just kind of like even, height brome grass when we started. We had set some pretty high kind of desired criteria for brome cover when we started the project. So yeah, even the control, I don't feel like I'm seeing a lot of bird use, but maybe I'm a plant guy. I don't pay attention to that terribly well. I don't know if others have observations.
I tend to be making piles of paper lately instead of spending too much time in the field, but certainly I think brome structurally gets used by birds. When I do get out lately, it seems like I see fewer bird nests than I used to, but brome does get used. Brome used to be one of the preferred seeding methods for say dense nesting cover or something for waterfowl production, as I recall, but it certainly gets used. It's just a matter of it'll be different species using different structures. If it gets used more or less than it did a few years ago, or more or less on larger or smaller plots, I can't really say, but I do agree with Dustin. I'm just the last several years, I just am not seeing the birds on the sites as I recall, and it could just entirely be my not getting out as much or as often or at the right time or anything.
I did see there's kind of another half of a question there on the bluegrass one. So we did see, yeah, pretty dramatic declines of bluegrass in my estimation. In terms of decline in brome, the way I think I stated it was we saw less of an increase in the spring burn plots over time. We didn't really see, a big dip after the burn, but they're not quite increasing at the rate that the control plots are. We definitely didn't see a decrease in brome sales over time. There has only been one burn period, so we're burning again this year, and hopefully we, start to see some progress there.
All right, so I am going to keep us moving on the virtual tour here. We're gonna head further northwest up the Minnesota River to a large prairie complex that includes a combination of parcels owned by the Nature Conservancy and the Minnesota DNR. The Nature Conservancy purchased its first tract of land at Chippewa in 1971. Subsequent purchases have brought the total Chippewa Prairie Preserve to 1,143 acres, making it one of the Minnesota's chapter's largest preserves. Combined with the Chippewa Prairie Preserve is the 24,300 acre Minnesota DNR Parle Wildlife Management Area. which follows along the upper Minnesota River Valley. Parle Lake and Marsh Lake are prominent features within this large WMA. At this stop, Dave Treba, Fred Harris, and Walt Gessler from Minnesota DNR, along with Ben Gary from the Nature Conservancy and Ben Johnson, a co-op grazer, talked about the site's management history, along with the patch burn grazing and associated research being conducted. Unable to join us the day of the tour, but a huge part of the planning and execution of this stop, Joe Blastic with the Nature Conservancy is able to join us today. So we welcome him to the discussion live. Fred, Walt, Joe, anything you want to add? I know, Fred, you had a little more background on the site too. Would you like to say anything before we kick off to the video?
Sure. I just wanted to throw in the fact that the landscape context here is really interesting. It's the site's located on a terrace along the Minnesota River. The terrace was formed by an enormous glacial river that flowed through the area about 10,000 years ago. And because it was a riverbed, it was full of boulders. And because of those boulders, it never got plowed. And so this site that we're going to talk about at Chippewa Prairie is part of a long, continuous zone of prairie that's at least 16 miles long on this terrace that couldn't have been plowed in the past. And it's part of the largest concentration of mesic prairie that's left in southern Minnesota. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Fred. Anyone else want to add anything before we go to the video?
I just think real quick, Judy, for context, we should add here that when we're talking about our stocking rates, because that's a pretty good theme of the video and the clip, we modified things, and we could talk about that with questions and stuff afterwards. That when you think of patch burn grazing, generally speaking, you're talking about eliminating or consuming, 100% of the forage in your burn unit. That's kind of typically how it goes in the Flint Hills and further south. For this particular site, we modified that to where we wanted to get more heterogeneity on the site, across the site. And we played with the numbers quite a bit, but we were really targeting the grasses, letting the cows come across and get a bite or two of the grasses and kind of leaving the forbs alone. So we had a lot of that overhead structure for birds and critters and those sorts of things. So we can talk more about the numbers after the fact, but I just want to throw that context in there. I know Ben talks about it on the day of. So, and I have a map we can throw up too if folks want to look at a map after the fact.
So what I do as a regional wildlife manager, I oversee all wildlife operations in the 32 counties in the southwest part of the state. So habitat management is what we do. We acquire about 4,000 to 5,000 acres a year, mostly cropland, and our crew works hard on restoring those acres back to functional prairie systems. And if you open your map here, you can see our previous burn blocks. And we probably had 18 different burn units. That's not the important part I want to talk about. That's how many landowners we had out here when the project began. And now we're talking back going into the 60s and 70s. So you had 16 different landowners. They all had 16 different management styles. Some were grazing, some were haying, and that still replicates itself or expresses itself with the plant community you see out here today.
We've been working hand in hand for about 10 years doing this patch burn graze, and it's been a really good agreement with both of us, and it's worked out really good.
We do a modified patch burn graze out here. You know, when you think of patch burn graze, you're typically trying to remove all of the available forage. We basically want the cows to target our grasses. We want to save some of our forbs, so we stock it a little lighter. I think the first year it was done, they stocked it at 1.2 animal units per acre, and that was back in 2012. And the result of that was they hammered it. They took everything away, and people socially kind of got a little upset, like, oh, look at this, it doesn't look good out here. So then in 2013, They tried it at 1.6 animal units per acre. So when it gets stocked, we're basing our stocking rate off of the size of our burn patch. So everything else is just kind of lightly grazed, and that helps us create this kind of flowing mosaic of really short structured grass. Nearby you've got slightly longer than elsewhere. It hardly looks like it's been touched. So that leaves cover, varying heights of vegetation. And it's been a work in progress. So every year we're adjusting our stocking rate based on how the cows have been grazing and what it looks like just visually. So we went as light as 1.7 animal units per acre, and that was a little too light. We didn't really see get any grazing effect on the patch. So I think our balance is like right around 1.5, 1.6. And that seems to work pretty well with Ben, and I think all of our researchers out here, we try and keep them all happy because there's a lot of different people involved in this project. Going back a little bit, Dave started talking about fence and how we wanted to create this. No cross fencing. Everybody spent a bunch of time ripping out old fence. And we felt it looked like an eyesore to have fence just running all over the place. So we perimeter fenced it. We went and we used, as you can see, we used all green T-posts. So when you're driving down the roads, it doesn't even really look like there's a fence out here. So there's that kind of visual aspect to it as well. This year, like Walt said, we burned a larger patch. I think we included 3 units this year. Whereas when we first started it, after we completed one cycle, so burning 5 units, we said that was a cycle. And we sat back and we looked and we said, what happens if we go bigger? So no longer do we really burn 1 unit. We tried burning 2 units or 3 units. And because this was a tough spring for us to, one, get out here and get everything up and running, and to save time and trying to work with Ben to figure out how many cows we're going to put out here, we just kind of said, whatever we've usually been putting out. So this year is an oddball year in terms of grazing and burning.
In Minnesota, most of our prairies are managed by fire. You go with Ben in South Dakota, just a few miles that way, and it's all cattle. We're working with these guys all the time. It's like, then all of a sudden this patch burn graves. It's really Pyrrhic hybridy, fancy. You know, fire, you know, basically cattle fire, grazing driven by fire. Wow, what a concept. Bison herds, elk herds, fire. And we wanted to get the structural heterogeneity back on this prairie. Yeah, it's wonderful. You would burn it and you get this tall structure. That's all we had. Medium and tall. We didn't have the short. What about all the birds that need the short grass? So that's where we started getting into this, rolling heterogeneity and then diversity. And were people nervous? I was nervous. Fred was nervous. Robert Dana was nervous. We're bringing out cattle to one of the best of the best.
Cattle grazing as a management tool is relatively new to Minnesota. It's been, as Dave mentioned, it's been done a lot in the Dakotas, but it didn't really start getting promoted or used in Minnesota until around the mid-aughts, 2005, 2009. And there were a lot of questions about what, and so the reason that cattle grazing is important as a management tool is the structural alteration that Dave mentioned to try to create short grass, shorter habitat that benefits certain wildlife like meadowlarks, upland sandpipers. The other motivation was to have another tool to control invasive species, and another motivation was grass banking, which Walt mentioned, where producers rest their pasture in exchange for grazing on state land. But there are a lot of questions about what is going to be the effect of grazing management in our prairies in Minnesota. And a lot of the literature that comes that is about stuff like patch burn grazing comes from hotter and drier places like Kansas and Oklahoma. And the question is, how does that work in Minnesota, which is a cooler, moister environment than those places? In addition to that, a lot of the literature doesn't at all examine the effects on invasive or non-native species versus native species. And a bunch of ecologists and botanists here had a lot of questions about that. So we got started on setting up a program to monitor the grazing component of management at sites like this. We have several places in the state where we're trying to get at what's the contribution of the grazing component. In order to do that, we set up a monitoring design where we have paired plots, one of which is in an exclosure like this, and one of which is nearby but open to grazing, so that we could compare grazed versus ungrazed. We got these plots established and set up before any of the recent grazing started out here. So that was in 2011, and the patch burn grazing started in 2012. We sampled it, I think about 4 times now so far. And what we're finding in this particular project is that we're not finding a significant difference in the diversity of native species between the grazed and the ungrazed, which is actually an encouraging outcome for a lot of ecologists who are worried about what this is grazing going to do. It's not altering the native vegetation. We're not finding a difference in the diversity of non-native species between the exclosures and the grazed plots. But what we are seeing is a steady increase in the abundance of non-native species in both. And the main driver of that is smooth brome grass, which you see a lot of out here.
I think there's a lot we don't know about recoupling fire and grazing interactions. So that's where, again, and I know we're not going to go back to the 1800s, right? But we had bison herds in Minnesota. We had elk herds in Minnesota. So these prairies did evolve with a certain amount of grazing. So I think tying that interaction together, now my memory bank's going off more, Wall can jump in. People tell me cows aren't browsers. They don't help on woody cover control. I would beg to differ. When you do a patch burn graze, everything is lush. Even those, what I'll call invasive trees that are poking through and the cattle are going in there and grazing them. They're pushing into the patch, the plum thickets. They're opening that up. So I think you have some woody cover control by having grazing animals back on this landscape.
All right, I'll open it up if any of the presenters have anything else that they want to note. Otherwise, if you have questions, make sure you're throwing them in the chat or the Q&A.
I can go. So as the managers have been getting together to talk about what potential tweaks we could do to management to help suppress smooth brome invasion, the smooth brome, because it's increased so much out there. And so one of the things we're having talks about is the possibility of having more frequent fire out there. Right now, we have 5 burn units, and each unit gets burned once every 5 years. Instead, we're going to talk about the possibility of having a burn for each area out there once every 3 years, to be burning more than one burn unit at a time. And then another variable we've been talking about is possibly grazing it later in the year, keeping the cattle out there until the end of October to get more impact on smooth brome, and because that's in the fall cool season. But that's tricky because we want to leave enough standing vegetation to run the fire for the next year, so that late season burning grazing has to be concentrated in an area that's not going to be the burn unit for the following year. So those are things we're talking about. I'll hand it over to Joe.
I think the video covered things pretty well. The site itself is pretty long and skinny, so the shape itself has a little bit of some challenges all on its own, but we have good water distribution. We work well with the producer. So that really helps for moving things around and putting up temporary wires for doing kind of strategic grazing, you know, where we want it to be at a certain time. One of the things that didn't get mentioned was sweet clover was originally a really big issue we identified out here. And when we talk about yellow and white sweet clover, we're referencing plants that are getting 6-7 feet tall. You know, a lot of times our seasonals would go and hide equipment in the clover and you'd have to go find it out there. So the grazing and management has led to sweet clover that's still there, but instead of being 6-7 feet tall, you know, it's more waist height. And I still believe that that's a better structure for birds and things versus the big tall stuff that doesn't belong there. So we're pretty happy with what we're seeing across the board. You know, this has been going on now for 11 years. Worked with a couple different producers. The grass banking came up a little bit, and that's where the producers we're working with essentially are resting their home pastures. So while they're on the Chippewa Prairie, there's no pressure at home. And the producers really like that. It's something that the couple we've worked with have been really happy with. It's just they haven't had the ability to rest their home pastures because financially they didn't have a spot to go. So we're really leveraging the site to get offsite benefits too. And that's really important.
All right, we have one question that's kind of in the Q&A, and we'll cover that one in the panel because it's a bigger, broader question that maybe all the panelists can chime in on. But we're gonna keep going with our tour here. I will bring up that. So last but certainly not least, we headed across the Minnesota River to the Hastad and Hageland waterfowl production areas, which protect nearly 1,500 acres of grassland and wetland habitats, which includes 990 acres of remnant prairie. Bruce Fresky with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service kicked off this stop talking about the Wetland Management District Land Acquisition Program. Then Sarah Vosick with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Fred Harris with the DNR discussed the wet meadow monitoring taking place on site along with other management activities. Bruce, Sarah, Fred, anything you'd like to add before we go to the video?
I don't have anything.
No, can't think of anything. Thanks, Judy.
I don't have anything either.
All right, Maura, let's roll the video.
Hageland Hastad, we started acquiring land here back in, I got a map here. First tract was 1968. The last tract we bought was in 2016. And more recently, some of the tracts we've acquired, they aren't necessarily for the purposes of prairie protection. Sometimes there's other reasons. So for instance, you can look at this one map here. There's one tract we bought in 2004. It was pretty much an entire European buckthorn forest, and we've gotten rid of that for the most part and gotten that back into grass. And then this 2016 tract had a lot of Siberian elm on it. It was seeding all over on the prairie. It was a nightmare. So when we finally had the chance to acquire it, we pushed it pretty hard to get it. And Pheasants Forever actually acquired it for us, and we were able to get rid of all those Siberian elm, and it saves us a lot of headaches in the long run having that gone. One other thing I was going to mention is that you know, whenever you start looking at large blocks of habitat in western Minnesota, we generally collaborate pretty well with our partners. We all have some similar goals, and so you tend to find a large block of habitat, but you'll see other types of programs going on. So here's Hageland Hastad up in here, but to the north is the Lac of Parle WMA, which is like 24,000 acres, and then to the west you got Big Stone Refuge, another 11,000. You got Hageland Hastad is about 1,500 acres. We got a habitat easement with a landowner. There's some DNR or prairie bank easements. There's also Fish and Wildlife Service prairie easements down to the south of here. So just a wide variety of different type of habitat protections that help protect a larger complex or block of grassland habitats.
We developed a GIS-based tool to help us prioritize WPAs based on our goals, mainly waterfowl conservation, but then also prairie protection, wetland protection, endangered species, some of those different kinds of things that we tend to focus on. And when we did that, then we were able to sort of lump our different WPAs into categories of our highest priority ones. We call them showcase units, where those are ones we always are going to make sure we're doing some good management on, spending as much time as we have to keep them open grassland and do weed control on them and make sure they're getting fire, all that kind of stuff. And then we've got a couple of other categories of high priority, medium priority, low priority. This Hastad Hegland complex came out as our #1 highest priority. Part of that is because it is large. So I can't remember now if Bruce even mentioned that it's about 1,500 acres between these two WPAs. We're standing on Hastad right now, which runs here and west and then south some, and then on the other side of the highway is Hegland WPA. So because it is such a big area, we have this whole complex split into about 5 different burn units. Within those, when we do graze on these sites, what we have started doing in recent years is within any given one of those larger units, we're splitting that into multiple grazing cells. And so we're really looking to try to mix things up as much as we can with timing and with tools, because we feel like that really does the best for our remnant prairie to keep things healthy. This unit has had a pretty regular rotation of burning and grazing and tree removal activity going on since the early 70s, when we really started buying a lot of this land. This is a difficult burn unit for a lot of different reasons. This is a pretty major highway. There's another county tar road that runs along the north end of it. The town of Appleton's a hop, skip, and a jump away. We've got a very highly smoke-sensitive person who lives in Milan, which is a little town, a hop, skip, and a jump that way. And so there's really a very limited amount of burn days that we have out here, and it's a tough one to burn. So we have been interested in introducing more grazing here, and wanted to be really careful about it because it is such a special prairie and such a high quality site. It's been a great partnership between us and the DNR to be able to do that together. And the question really is to try to get at the effects of grazing in those wet meadow communities. On this site, we actually ended up using exclusion areas, kind of like they have at Chippewa Prairie for some of the grazing stuff going on there, a little bit smaller, different configuration, but we've got paired plots on wetlands where we've got an area that every time it gets grazed, those areas get fenced out so the cattle can't access them. And then there's a plot on that same exact wetland basin, usually on the other side, with a similar plant community that that the cattle do have access to. And so we've got a really nice side-by-side comparison from the first time the site was actually grazed. Cattle can prevent an invasion from starting, depending on how a site is grazed. But I've seen many, many examples where there's a fence line going right down through the middle of a wetland, and the wetland on the grazed pasture side looks very different than the side on the public land that is more commonly rested. Our side tends to be more reed canary grass and cattail, and the pasture side tends to be what I would consider to be a little bit more of a healthy looking wetland plant community. And I've seen the same thing with trees. But that doesn't mean that you can use grazing to eliminate an already established problem. And it's the same thing with woody vegetation. Cattle will eat new shrubs and trees when they're tiny and still really lush and not too woody. So you may not see as many of them in a prairie that's being grazed, but as soon as those trees get bigger and the cattle aren't interested in it, then the grazing actually can have the opposite effect and increase the amount of shrubs that are out there. So there's a lot of things you have to consider and think about.
Fred, Sarah, Bruce, anything you want to add? Well, and others, make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A.
I don't have anything to add off that. The reason we're monitoring those wet meadows is that with cattle, sometimes they're attracted to wetland places that have when there's standing water in them when the cattle are out there. And so we're looking to see whether they're having an impact, positive or otherwise, in some of those shallow wetlands that are out there.
All right. Well, if there's no further comments on that, it kind of concludes the video portion of the virtual tour. And now I'm going to hand it back to Lisa, who is going to facilitate the panel discussion. And all the tour stop leaders that were able to stay on are here. And so please ask your questions, share your thoughts. It doesn't have to be a question. Tell us what you think, good, bad, or otherwise. We want to hear it. We can't learn from hosting something like this if we're not giving honest feedback. So I encourage you all to comment, ask questions, everything as I hand it back to Lisa.
Thank you all. Judy. I'll go ahead and invite all panelists to share their screens, turn the videos on, unmute yourselves. There have been so many great questions asked throughout the program and so many really rich answers. So we don't have a lot going into this panel discussion. Judy and I saved a couple just to, because they felt like good questions to engage more than just one or two of you in. So we're going to start with those, but yeah, just to echo what Judy just said, please, everyone and anybody that is in the audience, please, now's the time to get good access to these folks that are sitting here in front of you. So this goes, and I know that someone did provide a little bit, their perspective on an answer to this question, but somebody asked about the public helping care for prairies, and the example was the prairie enthusiasts and the fact that they've got chapters in eastern Minnesota throughout a lot of Wisconsin and northern Illinois. But not out in western Minnesota. Can you tell us if or how the public has been involved with the many management activities in this particular prairie partnership? Are there any volunteer events, or is work exclusively being done by paid contractors or trained professionals within your agencies and organizations? Any experiences you'd like to share?
Well, the Minnesota Master Naturalist Program, there's been several times we've hosted day-long or maybe 2-day-long events, and at least one up in the area, the Randall area, where they were there to learn, but they also are there to work, and did a bunch of cedar and woody invasive stuff. But that's about the extent of it. Some Boy Scout stuff, and that's about it for me.
Yeah, like I said in the Q&A, we've done a few projects with Master Naturalists. Being a donor-based organization, TNC has a lot of donors that want to help. So we do some work with them on seed collection in the Ordway Glacial Lakes landscape. A couple of our preserves close to the Twin Cities have more dedicated groups of volunteers. I think for most of western Minnesota, though, the problem with public involvement is just population. It's just not enough people to really have a good volunteer base. So if anybody's got ideas for boosting the number of volunteers to help on the landscape, we're open for input on that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. With the Scientific and Natural Areas program, we host volunteer events, and we've hosted some seed harvest days. And the further you get from the Twin Cities and Duluth and those metro areas going west, the numbers start to decline. I know Brad's had some success. Maybe he wants to touch on that with hosting bio blitzes and getting attendance at those. And we've done some virtual bio blitzes that we've had good luck with too, but that's more in data collection. And we do host stewardship events all over on SNAs. And again, that kind of same thing. The further you get from the metro, the less volunteers that show up.
Yeah, I'll just step in then. And yeah, I thought the question was habitat work. And for the most part, once you get west of New Ulm, I think, so, this area, for the most part, we've had some people show up and do seed harvest. We have some people occasionally do some spot spraying of invasives for us out, in this general area, but it's real limited. It's probably a couple people, maybe a couple days for individual a year if you add it up on the SNAs in that area. If we get farther east, we have more volunteer activities on woodland areas, and there is a prairie enthusiast chapter. I think the nearest one is Mankato, which is kind of on the edge of the prairie, edge of the big woods in, maybe an hour and a half east of this area. Seems like there's more interest in the hook and bullet type of aspects out this way than, but anyhow, but we do have outreach events and, again, somewhat limited interest compared to the metro areas, but we usually get people showing up for educational events.
Judy, you may want to mention the Prairie Landowner Network and the webpage. You've been deeply involved in that, and I've been very impressed.
Yeah, we 3 years ago, I think 2 years it's been kicked off. We went and got a grant from the Environment Natural Resource Trust Fund lottery dollars to start the Minnesota Prairie Landowner Network in an effort to connect landowners to each other and to conservation practitioners across the state. And when we launched it, we were kind of in the beginning of COVID and the pandemic, and we launched it through social media by starting a Facebook group. And we had practitioners from all across the Prairie region tied to the Prairie Plan. We just went to all the local technical teams and said, hey, you want to help us launch this? And we just had tremendous support. And we launched the network on Facebook, and we have in 2 years, we'll be coming on, I think, our third year. We're up to, like, I think this morning it was like 905 members on our Facebook group. So we've averaged a person a day growth on our Facebook group. It's starting to slow just like a little bit now, but considering the fact that we only have 250,000 acres and maybe only 2,200 native prairie landowners that own remnant prairie in the state, I mean, 900 in a Facebook group is pretty good for us. And we've had really good following there. We did try to host a couple of events, just like gatherings to talk about prairie management last year. We did 2 events. One along the Minnesota River and then one north of the Glacial Lakes area that we toured today. And we really just didn't have that great of turnout. We are going to think harder and better ways to advertise and promote the events. But we are getting good response on the Facebook group. The other thing that we've done in the last couple of years is we revamped our prairie web pages. You guys can check them out at minnesotadnr.gov/prairie. And we just tried to create a better platform that connected all of our partnerships better. And it really, was framed off of a book that we wrote. All the partners came together and we wrote the Prairies of Minnesota Landowner Handbook. And we've also been offering that out free to landowners to help support management guidance and give management guidance. So, I mean, we've been doing other outreach methods that aren't quite as like in person as some of our historic things have been, but they seem to be well received. Part of that Minnesota Landowner Network is also a newsletter we send out every year. And every year I get phone calls after we sent the newsletter, like, oh, you got to get my sister on your mailing list. Like, she would love this. Like, so, I mean, it seems like it's well received.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for that. And certainly feel free to use chat or the Q&A to answer that question in any more depth. We've got a few more that have come in here as we've talked. Stephen Tomford is asking, what do you think the mechanism is for reducing brome cover by more frequent fire and grazing? Is it merely stressing photosynthetic potentials, or might there also be an impact on available nitrogen and or soil carbon nitrogen ratios by biomass harvest? In parentheses, fire and grazing, oxidation or increases in carbon nitrogen ratios. That might be a Dustin question. It might be.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one we're trying to figure out. It's probably a combination of all 3 of those things. It's really just what's the weight of them, what's the most important We started the brome study actually because we had made some observations about some sites that were regularly hayed in the fall that actually seemed to be resisting invasion by brome. And so when you hay stuff in the fall, you actually you're getting a lot less nitrogen off of the landscape than they would haying other times. And I think maybe that would suggest that, you know, they're removing nitrogen from that landscape by fall haying, but that was probably enough to keep it in a more natural nitrogen regime or levels of nitrogen. So I think there's some evidence pointing that way. Some other work that Sarah had done kind of suggests that maybe our timing isn't as important as we think it is, which I think also suggests that really this is a nitrogen issue. Some other research that's happened in the past, you know, suggests it's really about hitting the brome and reducing carbohydrates during the active growing periods. So, I mean, we're hoping in our study we can at least start to get a picture of that with things like the soil measurements initially and the soil tags to measure the plant available nitrogen. You know, if we're not really seeing changes in those things, then it's really about the carbohydrates or the photosynthetic potential. If we are seeing changes of those things and they either go along with or kind of predict changes in brome tillers, then, you know, we've got some thinking to do about management for nitrogen instead of necessarily trying to hit brome timing.
So I can add to that. The convention has been to try to hit brome when it's most actively growing in the cool season because of it's most actively accumulating carbohydrates at that time, and you're supposedly have the best chance of stressing it out at that time, usually late spring or in the fall. There's some sort of anecdotal evidence for and against that, but in terms of grazing effects, that's something that really needs more research to figure out whether grazing really is effective at controlling brome if you concentrate grazing at those times when it's thought to be most vulnerable to control. And there's not enough data or research on that. In terms of soil nitrogen, some studies at Kansa Prairie show that fire volatilizes nitrogen from the system. It combusts it and flushes it out of the system. And so in terms of its effects on soil nitrogen, fire should have a positive effect in reducing soil nitrogen, which would reduce the competitiveness of smooth brome in a system. By contrast, grazing without fire has the opposite of effect of increasing soil nitrogen. So that effect of fire is one argument for increasing fire frequency that possibly has a beneficial effect through soil nitrogen. But in terms of grazing, we just need more data. We need more people to try intensive grazing during that time when we think brome is vulnerable and get data on that.
Anybody else have anything to offer there?
I'll just add that the issue of smooth brome, especially, but also Kentucky bluegrass to a little bit lesser extent, are probably, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest things that we need to figure out for prairie management in the upper Midwest and the Northern Great Plains. You know, when we're thinking about the future of our prairies and how to help them be resilient to climate effects and other big scale anthropogenic changes that are happening. If our prairies are getting taken over by brome, in the meantime, there's not any prairie left to help. So it is something that there are lots of different groups and lots of different people interested in looking at in different ways. And, you know, this is, I mean, not to toot our own horn, but that is one really nice thing about the Prairie Partnership in Minnesota, is that we have such a close working relationship between different agencies that have different things to bring to the table and ways to help answer questions, that I think it's been good that we're able to, you know, Dustin and Fred know about some of the adaptive management things that we're working on in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that they're also participating in. And, you know, we are in touch with varying study. That kind of synergy is really, really good, I think, for our future.
Thanks, Sarah.
I might add real quick too that producers are also very interested in these equations and what we're trying to figure out here. For resilience during the drought, for loss of forage during the summer growing seasons, and these brome dominated grasslands, they lose out on forage production, and then they end up having to buy hay. It, you know, kind of hits their wallets too. So this isn't just the conservation lands issue. It's a much broader problem across the board, and there's a lot of other folks watching too.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, ready for another question. This is from Paul Zedler. Have you tried what I think is called mixed grazing? Using a greater diversity of grazers, sheep, goats, and cattle, or maybe even llamas in various rotations. Fred alluded to this a little bit, but what are your thoughts on mixed grazing?
I'll let Joe address that.
So there's definitely something to it, right? Like the challenges we have in Minnesota is it's actually hard to find producers with cows in certain parts of the state. So that just finding one species is one problem. Then to find multiple species and have the infrastructure. So availability is kind of a challenge. The goats and the sheep are definitely getting used for brush control, as well as leafy spurge control, those sorts of things. But in terms of having herds of mixed species, not a lot of that going on. And honestly, when we build our infrastructure, 3 and 4 strand barbed wire is pretty typical, or 3 strands, 4 strands of electric is pretty common, I would say. That's not going to really work very well for multi-species grazing. So there's an infrastructure problem too. So is it warranted? Absolutely. I think there's a lot of meat on the bone for trying those sorts of things. Is it common? Probably not across a broad geographical area. Somebody else can jump in too if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, I was just going to say out of our office, I think we probably average around like 35 units that get grazed each year. And I can think of 2 of them in the past 5 or 10 years that have had more than one species on at a time. And it is just mostly access to cattle are limited enough, like just exactly what Joe was saying, cattle are limited enough in availability, and having access to other species of grazers is just a limiting factor for us for sure.
Yeah, and I would add, like, to pay someone to come in with goats can get expensive. It can be more expensive than some of our other treatment methods. So even though we are doing that in places, you know, I think opportunity and costs come into play too in all of that, and being able to afford to bring them in.
Okay. Leonardo Cabrera from Canada, Parks Canada, asks, are there any considerations or plans for this prairie region that would include Indigenous peoples' cultural perspectives of prairies and fire management? It's well known how important these perspectives were and still are, these landscapes for Indigenous peoples, for settling, provision of medicine, creation of hunting grounds, etc. Thank you. And congratulations on this very interesting workshop. So any thoughts on this? I know this was part of several conversations ahead of, as we were planning this workshop. Judy, others, Steve, I don't know.
I'd say on the South Dakota side, we're doing a lot of fire outreach, getting landowners involved, actually doing fire. And various tribes have been pretty consistently showing up at some of these trainings in South Dakota. So on the South Dakota side, I cross the border back and forth quite a bit and do a lot of work on the South Dakota side as well. That folks are trying to get comfortable with it again and learn, and they're coming to workshops, they're intrigued. There's kind of this weird culture that we've found in South Dakota where people still acknowledge fire is really good. People want to burn. This is across the board, not just tribes in particular. But they haven't done it since they were kids. They might have seen their grandparents do it. So what we're finding is we're kind of starting and getting folks comfortable seeing smoke in the air and comfortable with what they're trying to do. And producers, tribes alike seem to be showing up and for all the reasons you listed, are taking note and trying to kind of build that culture back up to do more private lands burning or tribal burning.
Yeah, in Minnesota, we have the unfortunate situation that most of it was the Dakota that were mostly out in the prairies. And after the war, the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, most of the tribal members were moved out of Minnesota or expelled from Minnesota. And so other than four very small sort of enclaves where, you know, they were allowed to remain, most of the prairie area was basically, you know, removed of pretty much all Native American presence, just as the Norwegian and Swedish immigrants were coming into the state. So the traditional use of the land by Native Americans was broken back in 1860. And so there's been, you know, probably since then 3 or 4 generations that have had very little contact with the land. So one of the things we have to do in Minnesota is try to reestablish that contact, you know, and, you know, the absence of them for over 100 years has resulted that a lot of the memories and, you know, sort of traditions that Native Americans used in the land in this area, you know, was forgotten because, you know, they didn't live with it for you know 4 generations. So I think that's one of the things that we need to think about is, you know, as we, you know, these conservation lands, how might we reestablish some of those ties of Native Americans back to these conservation areas?
Yeah, I would add to that. Like, we don't necessarily have a specific plan, but the Minnesota DNR and the leadership in DNR have been meeting with the tribal governments and having discussions with them about things that we can do here in Minnesota. In small select cases, we found little partnership opportunities. You know, we've put native prairie banks on land so that it stays in private ownership and it's not open to the public, but we can help them manage it and have a partnership there. But in general, Steve's right. We just have a long ways to go there yet.
Okay. Any other input on that? And any other questions from the audience? Okay. I think we have exhausted all of these questions, and I just want to, on behalf of the organization, thank each and every one of you, each and every one of our presenters, our facilitators, for taking time out of their busy schedules yet again to be here today for you, the audience. This was tremendously rich. I'd like to thank our videographers. I thought the videos turned out really well and hopefully captured the really poignant messages that each of you here today on the panel worked hard to get across when we were all in person. So we'll make sure that these videos in this session live on for a long time. The recording will be made available to everyone within a few days, within the week. So yeah, keep it, you know, be in touch, stay in touch. We're happy to put people in touch with one another. And we will try to continue to work to get this good information in this model program in front of others. Thanks to everyone. Happy New Year.